All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Neboja. Neboja, I would say, is probably our resident probabilistic and graphical modeling and Bayesian inference and that whole world of statistics expert. So if you have any questions in that area, he's a great person to talk to and learn everything that he knows in that area. And today he'll be talking about land cover mapping, a project that he's been working on for a little bit, and should be really interesting.
Thank you. So yeah, I'll talk about land cover mapping. That's not the only thing that I do. I do natural language processing, as Pranav mentioned, and computational biology as well, and computer vision. Basically, anything that you might think you can solve with machine learning, I might be interested in. Land cover mapping is something we started a couple of years ago as part of our AI for Earth initiative, which started at the MSR and then moved to SELA. Since then, there's been quite a few people that we worked with. From SELA, there's Lucas Joppa, who's running AI for Earth over there. Dan Morris, who used to be an MSR and was interested in mostly wildlife detection and classification, but then he moved full-time to AI for Earth, and then he also started working with us on land cover mapping. And then there was a number of current and former interns over the last couple of years, as well as now two AI residents, Andy and Blake. And then lots of external collaborators. I just mentioned some here. And I'm really bad at putting faces on the slides. This is how I'm going to organize the talk. First, there will be a relatively lengthy introduction, hopefully not too long, because I want to motivate the problem a little bit, because it's surprisingly versatile and useful for a variety of machine learning projects that you might be pursuing in other domains. And then I'll talk about our main goal that we started with, which was creating the first US-wide 1-meter land cover map, which resulted in 2 publications and a map that's going to be publicly available in a week when the paper is published at CVPR, and the demo as well. And then I'll talk about a couple of ideas we've been exploring this summer. And some are actually already under review, and some are just starting, really. And then finally, if I have time, I'll mention some applications and collaborations with outside entities, as well as open problems. So I'll start with where we were a couple of years ago. We decided that we should take this labeled data set that Chesapeake Conservancy created. And this was a data set where, for about 160,000 kilometers squared, they have labeled every square meter with one of a few labels, such as water, tree canopy, low vegetation, house, road, and so on. And then the idea was, if we train a model on this, can we then use that model and map the entire United States and create a first map of that kind? So you start with something that's 2 or 3% of the territory, and then you spread it on the entire United States. It is interesting that Chesapeake actually spent 10 months creating this data set. It costed them $1.3 million. They didn't do it for us. They did it because they needed the labels. This is the interesting thing in this work, is that the labels are actually goal in particular area. The algorithm is sort of nice if it can transfer, but they really want the labels in the area. So they did it to control the water quality, to inform conservation efforts, and so on. So it costed them that much. Now the question is, can you do this in a much cheaper way using machine learning, and how? This is what their data looks like. So this is the Chesapeake watershed, and they've broken this whole thing into tiles. And then one of these tiles would look something like this. The image on the left is the so-called NAPE image from National Agriculture Imagery Program. It has RGB, but also near IR channels. And the labels are on the right-hand side. If we zoom in a little more, you can see what quality of the labels we might see. It doesn't show all the sort of errors we might get, but you can see some things like a break in the road here. Often the roads are actually classified as water because they're kind of cold and sometimes have similar color as the water. And then you might miss some of the small built features and so on. However, you can see it's a highly crisp, very precise map where you can see individual houses, driveways. You can actually see cars in these images. So, of course, the goal then is if we take a lot of pairs of images like this, can I just train a segmentation network that will then be capable of taking any image of this kind and produce the appropriate labels for every pixel in the image. And before I talk about all the troubles in doing this, I should also mention why we want to do this. So one is change detection. For example, you want to monitor urban sprawl, and if you just look at how much the image has changed from one year to another, it doesn't really tell you much because the change is large because of texture change, but you have to actually classify this and realize whether or not there was actually a land use change. So then if you can actually use predictions that might help realize that actually something was built here. And then Chesapeake was particularly interested in analyzing riparian buffers, which are these interfaces between water and land, because that informs them about the quality of the water. If you don't have enough vegetation and have too much built nearby, then you might have runoff, and that will ruin the quality of the water. And of course, it will ruin the habitat for fish and so on. But for a variety of reasons, they really care about these buffers. Then, of course, you could be looking at deforestation. When a new neighborhood is built, did they cut more trees than they promised? These are the sort of things that are sometimes really hard to tell unless you go to the high resolution, like here, if you have a high resolution map, versus what we used to have everywhere in the United States, these low resolution labels at 30 meters, it is hard to see some of these things. Now, on the issue with labels, I should mention that this is the sort of a label quality that we get from Chesapeake. And if you stare a little bit, you can see in this area there are errors that some of the impervious surfaces were classified as water. You'll see that also in the road here. But they're very high resolution, and you see quite a bit of what's going on there. The National Land Cover Database has labels at 30-meter resolution, and they look like this for that same area. And you have more classes, not just the 4 I was showing, but you've got also classes that are kind of mixed. They will tell you that there is a certain percentage of built in a block. So they'll break all the urban blocks into low density, high density, medium density, and open space with different percentages of impervious surfaces and vegetation. And then there are some classes like snow and ice, or classes like prairie, or class like agricultural land versus low vegetation brush, and so on. So there are 20 classes, and they're usually mixed. But they're very low resolution, like you can see here. And also, we get these only every few years. Back when we were working on this last summer, we only had a map that was 7 years old. And then Christmas time, they came up with 2 more for 2013 and 2016. But anyways, you get them rarely. And also here you can see mistakes as well. If you stare at them, there's a lot of mistakes that are being made on these maps as well. But that's the best we have in terms of the labels. Now, the difference is that these are available everywhere in the United States, and the Chesapeake labels only in Chesapeake's watershed. So that's the sort of a problem that you deal with. But if you pop up a level and think about what are all the possible things people might be doing with this sort of data, you will have different types of images at different resolutions, different longitudinal frequency of sampling them. Landsat, for example, is public. It provides 30-meter images on a weekly basis, but it's 30-meter, not 1 meter. That's the input, not the output. The NLCD is actually based on Landsat. That's why it's 30 meters. Label data is sparse, and it's usually at low resolution, as I mentioned about NLCD, and that the tasks can vary a lot. Chesapeake actually has realized that they really wish they had included wetlands in their set of classes, so now they want to work with us on redoing the wetland classification. And in fact, various collaborators, ducks.com, I think that's what they call ducks.com, they're actually into hunting ducks, so they want to maintain wetlands. They're interested in this, but then also NOAA is interested in tracking wetland destruction in the Gulf. For everybody who went to ICLR the other couple of weeks ago, you've learned about New Orleans slowly sinking precisely because they're controlling where the water goes. New Orleans has more canals than Venice, and they don't allow anything to be too moist. And so the whole area is settling and sinking down because there's no new mud to come and cover everything. And so the wetlands are being destroyed. And then, add a hurricane or two, and then things get changed quite a bit. And nobody knows the extent of it, and they would like to track that. And then you might want to map coffee farms. That's a different category. In developing world, they want to map resources because they actually, even for building and roads, they don't know what they are because there's a lot of wild building. In Africa, they want to also find where the buildings are, but because they want to know where the population is, so they know where they are when they need to get to them. And then you have disaster response when you have flooding and so on. So the tasks and applications are varied, and the labels can be totally different from what we have right now. And the important thing is that you get actually extra 6 terabytes of imagery per day just from one of the companies that provides this data, Planet Lab. And Planet Labs launched their first satellite in 2013. So this is all very recent, this explosion of imagery that you can get. There are other companies. Airbus is making drone imagery. And then there are startups that are planning to actually have video rate imagery for a region that you ask for in advance, but daily imagery for most things. So we are maybe a year or two away from having daily imagery of the entire planet. And right now, Planet is pretty close. Planet Labs is pretty close. They might have weekly instead of daily. Now, this is a surprising thing. Blake asked, what is the market size for GIS or geospatial analytics? And then Anthony, one of the previous interns, found this market report where they say that the current market size is $41 billion. And by 2023, it's going to be $86 billion, which was a bit surprising to me. In comparison, cloud is $272 billion. And it's going to be 623 by 2023. And AI software is 9.5 billion. It will be 71 billion by 2023. Now, predicting AI impact is black magic because you can get somebody predicting 1 billion and somebody predicting 8 trillion, depending on what they actually take into account. And I'm not saying that we should be doing geospatial analytics because there's money in it and because it makes us feel good, because wine industry is 108 billion and will be $450 billion. However, I remember when Jim Gray gave a talk in front of Craig Mundy about his work on moving all the data from the astronomy community onto the SQL Server, and he started the talk by astronomy is a $0 billion industry. And well, geospatial analytics is not. It's a pretty big industry. And in fact, pro groups at Microsoft are looking into these areas in Azure and also in Bing. And if you actually bought that report, instead of just looking at the highlights like I did, then they would break it by type. And I don't know how it's broken by type, but I thought I'd show you these types. So surface and field analytics, network and location analytics, geovisualization. And then by application, they break it into surveying, medicine and public safety, disaster risk reduction and management, climate change adaptation. And then by vertical, business, banks, insurance companies, Wall Street. And automotive, utility communication, government, defense and intelligence, natural resources. I just read those to you so you can you can imagine how and where these things would be used. But when we talk to our collaborators, we found that there is this bootstrap problem. So land cover mapping is labor intensive and is therefore very expensive. You have to buy this software, which is expensive. You have to learn how to use it. And then you have to spend time. The reason why Chesapeake spent $1.3 million in 10 months is because they do start with computer vision algorithms. They will run a computer vision algorithm that will segment the image into little polygons. And then these polygons are being classified based on shape and color and variation in color. And that gives them an approximate map, but then they go in and by hand fix it up. And then somehow, if they're very skilled, there are ways of using different rules for classification in different areas. So they will hand-tune those and say, if this is south-facing, then you should use this rule. But if it's north-facing side of the hill, then you should use this rule, and so on. So it takes a while. And so then, if a less well-funded agency realize that there is actually all this satellite data, that they could see a lot of things that would be difficult for them to keep track by surveying otherwise, going door to door and figuring out what's going on, or going into the forest and mapping it. And they would like to use satellite imagery, which is only a few weeks old or a few months old. The problem is they have to buy the imagery, and they have to then spend money labeling it, and they don't really know what they're going to get out of it. So there's a bootstrap problem. So all of these numbers from previous slides got to put into perspective that if we could somehow bring down the costs of this process dramatically, then there will be many new applications that aren't even foreseen yet. So back to the mapping of the United States at 1 meter resolution. The main problem is that this area here is lush and green, full of forests, and the rest of the United States is not necessarily like that. So it's training on this actually turns out to do relatively well here, where we are, but not here, and not in the swamp either. So this problem really becomes a domain adaptation problem in a sense. The rest of the US looks very different, and there are no labels. And of course, the desired labels themselves may change if we want to do wetlands. So then how do we adapt or retrain the models that we trained maybe in Chesapeake? What sort of guidance do we use? So you can refer to, in terms of, these other things like, meta learning, learning to learn, learning to forget, forgetting to learn, whatever. They're all sort of the same problem, right? And because of that, and because of all these growing applications, there's now rapidly growing interest in the machine learning research community. Last year at CVPR, there was a workshop and a challenge on land cover mapping. And then various machine learning groups are starting to get into this. Mila has hired postdocs and interns to work on that. Actually, one of their interns was our intern too afterwards. So there's a lot of interest now ramping up in this. So now, after this lengthy introduction, I'll talk about a couple of things we have done. So first, I'll talk about label super resolution. So our goal, as I mentioned, is you have this high-resolution satellite imagery, and every pixel is 1 meter squared, and you also have these high-resolution land cover maps that, well, you want to produce something of this quality. However, you don't really have that data everywhere. You only have it in a small amount of the United States. But you do have this data everywhere. So then the question is, can we use these low-resolution labels only and still create models that can predict high-resolution labels? So, in other words, you've got 1 meter imagery and 30 meter land cover labels, these, and you want to predict 1 meter land cover labels. So just using these things, you want to predict that, even if you've never seen an example of a high-resolution land cover map. So how would you do that? So if you're going to use a semantic segmentation network, for example, like this is a UNet that we used. And the way the UNet works is that you have a couple of convolutional layers, and then you have some upsampling, pooling and upsampling, and then you keep doing this until you have a compact representation of the entire image, and then you go backwards and upsample, and then there are these lateral connections as well that help you not blur the edges too much and so on. And we tried initially several different methods, and this one seemed to work the best, the UNet, on the high-resolution predictions, on the high-resolution data. So a network that would predict high-resolution data would look like this. It might predict these sort of this kind of segmentation for this image. But we don't, and if we were to train on Chesapeake, then we would simply have a cross-entropy pixel-wise comparison. The actual high-resolution ground truth is this and not that. So you have send a signal back that all these blue areas are actually supposed to be impervious surface. But if you don't have that to guide you, but you have low-resolution ground truth, there's still something you can do. You can look at each one of these blocks and then compare that block to what the counts of counts of labels are in this block. What percentage of this block is water, what percentage is field, what percentage is forest, and what percentage is impervious. And then compare with what you would expect in a block of this type of block in NLCD. Because these blocks actually have descriptions. So this is called developed low intensity, this type of block. And on average, you would expect 30% forest, 34% field, and 35% built. Then in the medium intensity, you'll have 64% built, and in developed open space, you're going to have only 12% built. So then if you can create a cost associated with these blocks here, should expect to see this proportion of the counts of labels in here and in here, then you can actually create a loss that you can minimize. So you count simply the labels here and compare them to the expected counts for the label there, and then you can backpropagate. Yeah.
So the 30-meter labels are hand done?
They are done just like everything in this is you use machine learning algorithms, and then you find and you fix them by hand.
So did you find these definitions seem so difficult for a person to?
These. Yeah, the definitions there in here. In here, these are definitions that are based on the statistics we find in Chesapeake.
Oh, I see.
So in Chesapeake, you can fine-tune these.
This isn't
but the statistics that they give are different. They're more like between 5 and 20% for this, and between 20 and 40% for this, and something like that, right? And you can use those as well, but we use the ones we fine-tuned in Chesapeake. So for 20 different classes, we have these distributions, and then we use those everywhere in the United States. Now, so you have predictions at 1 meter now. You make the model predict actual labels, so 4 classes. And then you find summarization at 30 meter and compare to the ground truth at 30 meters. So if you want to look at it more as a block, you do have a semantic segmentation network. It does take 1 meter resolution image, X, and outputs 1 meter resolution label image, Y. But then in every 30 by 30 block, you count the labels. And when you count the labels, actually, since these are probabilistic predictions anyways, coming out of softmax, then you're also estimating the variance of your counts. So that's what you send in here, like as a distribution, the mean and the variance around all of these things, which is very important early in the learning. And then you match that with the statistics you would expect from the low-res label, and then you can propagate things back and train the model. And once you've trained the model, you can do 2 things. You can throw all of this out and just use semantic segmentation network to make these predictions. Or you can, if you do have labels in a new area, you can also try to find these so that they best represent whatever semantic segmentation network wants, and what the signal from here would be.
Yeah. How are you using mean and variance when counts are integers?
The counts are integers, but the output here is probability of every label. So then when you add up these probabilities, you're going to actually get the mean, the expected number of pixels of a certain label. But there's also variance, which is the sum of p times 1 minus p. Yeah. So that's to Matt's point. This is how they defined the class 22 developed low intensity, impervious 20 to 49. Deciduous forest that has more than 20% of trees, and fields are the rest. So this is what you can backpropagate if you don't want to use the fine-tuned distribution from Chesapeake. So then you have these 2 images, and I'm going to represent this NLCD image in terms of these distributions. So I actually just average all the 4 classes in here to represent that expectation, so I can show you this thing in sort of as a distribution over what's happening in each of these blocks. And then we train the model as I described it, and this is what you have. But then if I look at a few iterations of gradient descent and look at the soft map, that's when I actually look at the full distribution POY given the input, rather than just the maximum, the argmax. Then you get something like this. You can still see the block structure from the NLCD. But then very quickly, you start to get these features, even though they're wrong. A lot of the fields are, so a lot of the road is classified as field. And then after a while, you start to actually get appropriate distributions. And this is sort of what you end with, and this is what we started with. So So this then allows us to do quite well in the rest of the United States. And we call this label super resolution because you have labels at low resolution. Input is at high resolution. And then you resolve the labels at the high resolution too. And actually, it's a general technique, so you can use it elsewhere. And we, in the iClear paper, we use it for pathology images as well, where pathologists have found that it's easy for them to label blocks and even use machine learning algorithms that predict what the probability of lymphocyte intrusion is in every one of these blocks. And they do that well, but they can't quite get the features. And we can, of course, in the same way, use these two to super resolve and find these lymphocytes. Yeah.
How do you know you do well? Because you don't really have the ground truth right at the rest.
I'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah. So of course, in the paper, what we did was we just tried to train on the south of Chesapeake and predict the north of Chesapeake, where we have labels, so you can make these predictions. So we have the numbers, but how do we know how well we're doing in the rest of the United States? That's a harder question.
I know it doesn't apply for everything, but there's a huge data coming from the OpenStreetMap community that can be used as a prior to help you. And I wonder how will you do that?
So we have used also data from Bing Maps. They've labeled building footprints in the United States, so that's helpful. And we can use their OpenStreetMaps as well. We don't have OpenStreetMaps everywhere, though. So we were studying how you could create a map that applies everywhere. And the other thing with the OpenStreetMaps is they're really interested in roads and buildings sometimes, but not so much in the vegetation discrimination, and that's part of the...
All it takes for the community is a good motivation, and they will just use an army that will go there and kill it.
Yeah. And you'll see it by the end. I'm going to get into that too. Okay, so then armed with label super resolution, you can imagine that now we can try and map the entire United States. And we did that. We have some high-res labels here, low-res labels everywhere, about 50 terabytes of data, 8 trillion pixels. And then you do a simple thing, which is you are training a network like this, a small UNet for the entire United States. And then where we have high-res labels, we use cross-entropy. Where we don't, we use super resolution. And we train the whole thing. We sample patches of land all over the United States and use super res loss there, and sample patches from the Chesapeake and use high-res loss. The thing is that you don't actually get much from training on all the data. You sample patches because the data is actually sort of redundant, which is going to be important later. But you can imagine that. If you have a pixel that's labeled for you and it's in the middle of a road, then getting a bunch more, which are almost identical, is not going to help you much. And the same in the field or water and so on. So sampling patches is usually better than taking the entire tile and training on the entire tile. Then we did some other tricks like color augmentation. We used additional inputs, multiple time point Landsats, leaf on, leaf off images, and then trained. The model is under-trained, as I said, because we're training this small model for the entire United States. We didn't know quite how much we're supposed to sample. In fact, the inference took much longer than the training, I think, about 10 days on 40 GPUs. And so we ended up with a map. Now, how good is the map? Well, we don't know. But what we can do is we can say, well, let's see, given that we are sampling at random and not covering everything, that it does make sense to just compute the agreement of our map with LCD labels everywhere, and that will reveal issues. And you can see issues. Wherever it's dark, it's pretty good. It's dark here. It's dark where we are. But in the rural sort of heartland, there are things that the model has never seen in the high resolution here, and we maybe didn't sample enough there with the NLCD loss. Dry areas are sometimes badly classified. This is Roswell, New Mexico, so we don't have data. And I don't know what happened here, actually. But by and large, it's the first of its kind. It's going to be public. People might be using it. Actually, there were some people at Microsoft who used it already for interesting applications in CSS. Yeah?
Can you go back to that map?
Yeah.
Do you know what? There's some like blocky things kind of near Michigan.
Yes. The blocks are
LCD data issues?
No, I think, and Caleb can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the NAPE imagery. So these planes that are flying over the United States, they take a couple of years to actually cover everything, and not every state is being captured at the same time. And so they'll do it state by state. And so you'll see the state boundaries actually sometimes in these things. Because these models are very sensitive to changes in the input distribution. Okay, so now the question is, we have these low-res labels and we can use them the way I described. But as I mentioned, maybe doing this dense prediction and having dense prediction data, even at low resolution, is maybe not necessary because point labels might be enough. Maybe I just need 400 points in a patch rather than the entire thing labeled. So then that's another approach. We can do point labels which are location precise in terms of location at 1 meter or close to 1 meter. But maybe possibly having direct label descriptions. What I mean by that is there's a lot of geotagged stuff out there. And they're kind of giving you with descriptions or without descriptions, they're kind of giving you the idea what might be there where you took the photo, for example. But they're going to be very sparse. And so the next thing I'm going to briefly talk about is something we haven't done much with, but we're starting to. And that's iNaturalist piece observations. And I'm going to talk about hybrid intelligence approaches to land cover mapping, where you actually kind of get both towards evaluating and using these fine labels and some more interesting things. So iNaturalist is this, well, it's a website, it's an organization, where when you take a photo of something, wildlife in particular, they're interested in wildlife, anything, a flower, a bug, an eagle, you take a photo, you upload it to their website with a label, and so they keep track of all of these things. And if you don't know what it is, there's a community that's going to try to label it for you. And you actually get a lot of labels everywhere in the world. For example, in Chesapeake watershed, you have these 63,000 observations. In the United States as a whole, you've got this. It's sort of funnily, it looks a lot like our quality map. So, but what does that look like? So you can actually look, if you go to that website, you can look underlying world imagery layer, so you can see where a thing was sampled. So here, somebody has taken a photo right there. And this is interesting because our models often mistakes water for road, especially if it's white water. But the label there is it's from the order of Pacific salmon and trouts. In fact, there's an image there, and there's even a description that it says it's a salmon, right? So you should know that it's not a road. And then if you look at the sightings of sea eagles and fish-eating eagles, you see them often close to the water on the edge. So that should be informative. And Eli, who's working on this project this summer, has looked at some distributions for brown pelican, chaparral, which is some sort of a brush, I guess, sage or something, and belted kingfisher. And you can see the different types of LCD labels. Where do you find these things? And they differ in distributions. You can embed those distributions, and you can then, here every circle is a species, and it's colored by the predominant terrain type that you find them, but you can see that sort of there is some sort of a finer embedding into these types, things that are on the urban interface between water and concrete. And actually, if you look at a more denser picture of things, you can start to see that actually we have very different types of land, and we could be getting predictions that are more fine-grained than even LCD is in terms of the labels, because we actually have very different habitats. So knowing which sort of mushrooms people have seen in the forest, which sort of bugs and which sort of animals, can create a new type of land cover index. And so this gives rise to some interesting ideas regarding unsupervised land cover mapping. And then here's this idea of using hybrid intelligence approaches to land cover mapping. And the question here, well, there are many questions here, but we can start with this one. How many new point labels do we actually need based on what I was telling you, that maybe we don't need to sample densely get a dense map of the entire image in order to train it, we just need a couple of points. How many is couple? So if we ask humans to label hundreds of thousands of points, and it turns out they can label about 300 points in 15 minutes. So then can you now readapt your model, maybe not by retraining the whole thing, but retraining the last k layers of the model? Or searching for a dropout configuration that matches, where you just randomly erase outputs of certain neurons, and then search for a configuration of these erasures that optimally damages the brain, as Jan LeCun would say, so that it actually starts seeing that a road is a road, not as a water. Then we also experiment with group norm parameter adaptation, where you're actually just taking a groups of filters and changing them in concert by just scaling them and shifting them. And you can, of course, do a lot of different other things. But then the question is, if you also retrain the model on the fly as the labelers are using it, if they can see the effect of their work, then maybe this will further increase sample efficiency as humans find better points to label. This is sort of what machine teaching people will, emphasize. And so we've done something like that. Is this going to play? Yeah. So I'm going to show you this funny video that Andy and Caleb have made, where they have, there's no music, so you won't hear the music. Music is awesome too. But they've made this, there you go. It's very self-explanatory, very short, so I'm not gonna talk. All right, so hopefully you get the idea. What do I do? Oh. So you get the idea. I'm supposing that you do, because Andy actually ran the study on Mechanical Turk, and that was the instructions that they got, and they were able to do it. So basically, the idea here is that you get to choose where you want to test the model, and you get to choose what you want to correct. And you don't even have to correct a mistake, because the model doesn't know where the mistake is anyways. You can reconfirm whatever the model was predicting. You can do whatever you want, essentially. And then the hope is that with this interaction, you're going to get to a good fine-tuning of the model faster than you would with other tools. The other tool would be normal crowdsourcing, where the system is asking users to label particular things by showing them the patch of land and say, what is that? And that's what we've compared with. Before we did all these comparisons, we first did an offline analysis. Blake and Anthony ran a study where they asked the question, if we do different adaptation methods, we can fine-tune the last layer or last 2 layers, the last 3 layers. We can do this group norm thing or dropout. We had some other ideas too, but this was expensive enough to try all of those things. Then how many training points do you need before you start doing well? And so they tried up to 2,000 points, and they got these curves with significance bands. And you can see that fine-tuning the last 2 layers and last 3 layers is basically the best, and they're essentially indistinguishable. They're equally good, which is why we chose one of the adaptation methods in our tool to be the last 2 layers. But last 1 layer is quite a bit different method, much faster, and the way we implemented it is that last 1 layer would be trained all the way to fitting perfectly all the data that's given, whereas the last 2 layers would only run for a certain number of iterations until, in terms of computation, they reach the last 1 layer. And so we decided to test those 2 things for the users. And then what we are showing here on the left is comparison of all these methods. But when we use random query method, which means that they sampled at random points from a tile in New York, and then they would take a model. Base model was trained in Maryland, and based on the labels that we have in New York, because that part of New York is in the Chesapeake watershed, then they would retrain that top layer or top 2 layers and see how well it does over time with more and more points. And then the graph here shows what would happen if you use the last 2 layers, only this method here that worked fairly well, and then try different ways of selecting points. Instead of randomly selecting them, you can select them using the entropy method, which is the traditional thing in active learning, min margin, which is basically looking at the difference between the predicted class and the next most likely class. And then we even use the method which we called mistakes, which is if the model somehow magically knew where it was wrong and sampled points only where the mistakes are, what would happen? Of course, in active learning, you can't do that. You don't know where the mistakes are. The reason why we did that is we wanted to see if the users are doing basically just being able to detect the mistakes and then choosing these mistakes at random. Well, it turns out that doing that is going to be worse than random or entropy, than random or min margin. Now, random and min margin was slightly better, but not that much better. And all of these curves can change quite a bit when you go from one area to another area. So we decided to go with the random in our tests and just test how well we do compared to the random method. And this is kind of known in active learning literature and machine teaching literature that it's very difficult to design an active learning strategy that does better than just randomly choosing points for labeling. Now, yeah?
Could you explain the results again? Is it that when you fine-tune on a small local patch, that means it generalizes better across the entire data set?
Oh, yeah, that's right. So here you're training with 2,000 points, but you're testing on the entire tile.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the goal here. You have only a few thousand points or a few hundred points, and then you test on the entire tile. And the question is, how many of these do you need? And
when you say tile, you mean the one that the user selected, or
no, that entire area.
Okay.
So it was 85 kilometers squared, and so they're supposed to spend 15 minutes on the 85 kilometers squared, and do as well as they can. And these are offline sort of simulations to see what would happen if we actually tell them where to label rather than let them label what they want. So in our study, Andy, who became an expert in mechanical Turk studies because of her work with Eche, she ran these studies on Turkers with 95% approval, and each would work 15 minutes in each of the 4 different areas in New York State. And then they always start with the same base model pre-trained in Maryland. And then they would work with 2 adaptation methods, but they didn't know that. The first 3 tasks were with 1 adaptation method, and the last we would switch the adaptation method on them without telling them. And all of this is happening in randomized orders. And the reason why we did this is we thought the first task, the first 15 minutes, is basically time where they learn how to use the tool. And then between the second and third task, we can see whether there is actually expertise being built, whether they stay, whether people who are doing well in the second task are also people who are doing well in the third task, where there's a skill differentiation. And then the switching in the fourth task, we want to see how do they react when actually that thing that they were working with and they might have been building a theory of mind of changes. Or are they just going around finding errors and clicking? And so first of all, humans, if you look at where they actually work, this is across all 50 users. These are not random places, as you can tell. They're drawn to some things. They do better than random. So if we tell them, if we randomly choose points everywhere and ask them to label them, they're not going to get as far in terms of mean IOU as they do when they get to choose what they want to do. These are the confidence intervals here, and this is the sort of the best user. And what's also interesting is that of the top 25 users in the second task, 17 are also in the top 25 in the third task. So it's not random. These results are not random. There's variation among people. Part of it is because of their interest in the task or skill. But then the correlation breaks in the fourth area. So you can't predict who's going to do well in the fourth area based on how well they did in the third area, which indicates that there is this theory of mind going on, that people actually understand what they're doing and they kind of understand the model. In fact, most people commented in the post-task interviews that there was a change, and they would call one of the models sluggish. They would say, well, it was kind of sluggish until the last task, or they would say, it was great until the last task, then it became sluggish. It was kind of mind-boggling to Caleb, who didn't see how could they see the difference. But when you play with this for 15 minutes, you see that it's not reacting to you, and you kind of start building ideas why and how. They can't quite put it all in words, but it was clear to us that they actually were getting the idea what's happening behind these adaptations. This is another interesting thing, although this is sort of, there's an asterisk here. So I said Chesapeake Conservancy spent $1.3 million doing this. If we are to believe these 4 85 kilometer squared areas that we played with, then it seems like our best user would be able to do that for $18.5 thousand in 925 hours, and with not much big drop of the accuracy. So we are hoping to get some other sort of numbers to see how much we can actually lower the cost. So the next thing that's really exciting for this summer is the idea of not having every user working on their own, but having them all working collaboratively on a large area. And then you have all kinds of interventions you can play with, like you can show heat maps to users. You can, for example, show them this, where people are working. How does that help? You can also play with letting users share the workload, so that one user works for a while and then they get tired of it and want to work to another area, the other user can take over, and various other things. One thing that we found is that 85 kilometer square area might have been too big for our adaptation method. So then the question is, what is the right size? You would have a different model, obviously, in every one of these areas where people are working. So you end up having this spatial ensemble where there's different model in different areas. So you could do that automatically in the sense that you could say there's M models, possibly with some trainable parameters, and then you're learning a spatial mapping function that maps lat long into a weight distribution over models, and you can mix these models either in the parameter space or in the prediction space, and you can do backprop through the whole ensemble. And then the final thing we want to do is sort of a collaboration challenge again, where we bring in a lot of people working in this tool to label things, and the model is automatically adapting, but we also want to bring machine learning teams from various labs to put in their models. And so we would have sort of a workshop where we're going for the collaboration challenge, where we're trying to map as much as possible rather than see who's the best. Sid?
What do you hope to get by allowing the workers to collaborate?
Just increase speed, efficiency.
It could decrease speed.
It could.
Because of
It could.
coordination costs and
It could,
like that.
and then we would not do that later.
Okay.
But it will be a result, right? We would like to know. Yeah.
In that active learning part, like where you had all those plots where you're random entropy
Yeah.
and you found, So I was wondering if you were to do like, these Bayesian neural network style, like basically like things, neural networks which bootstrap and GP thing, and then do your like, usual thing of like value of labeling a point, approximate like value of information.
Yeah.
Would that have any chance against random, or is that well known too?
So we don't know because we haven't tried. And actually, Caleb, we should try this. Ken also mentioned that. We should basically use Bayesian ensemble, dropout Bayesian ensemble or some other, or bootstrap, just train 5 models and see they're all uncertain in the same place. So these are the uncertain points. So we don't know this for sure, how it will work. We know from previous literature that whenever you think you can actually get the active learning to work, it becomes hard. And we also know from recent literature in neural networks that training on that it's not very intuitive on which sort of samples you're supposed to train. There was an iClear paper on these forgettable and unforgettable samples, for instance, and that might inform you about what you're supposed to be training on. But by and large, I don't know. It seems though the humans have no problem with it, and they spend the same amount of time actually working in our tool or crowdsourcing on their own. Gonzalo?
You probably did this, but is there a role for simulation to help with this? For if you use AirSim to presumably simulate the Earth, vegetation, buildings, and then we can photorealistically simulate the world, and then you have a perfectly labeled, infinite resolution sandbox. I think that can help in any way.
It might work. My knee-jerk reaction, if you asked me this 5 years ago, I would say, well, no. I mean, it's fake data, so you get a fake result. But these are getting so good, and people are getting boost from using this data in other applications, so it might work. It would be very expensive from the computational point of view, but actually, what is most expensive currently is labor anyway, so it might make sense to try. Yeah.
There's a problem with the AirSim approach that you will have to solve before, because AirSim really doesn't have, you would need to model the atmosphere on how the image would look like from very high above, and the game engines are not super optimized for that. Like you will have to build in, like actually the new flight sim might actually be better that way, right? Because they actually are modeling how a thing will look like from 6,000 feet or 10,000 feet or 30,000 feet, right?
Right.
Whereas we are basically in AirSim relying on Unreal as the rendering engine, right? So you will have to do special things.
Yeah, we should try that. So anyhow, the spatial ensemble I was talking about would look something like this. We're trying to get to this sort of classification of the image, and this is the image you have, and now some people are working here, and some people are working there, and some people are working here, and some people are working there, wherever they want to work. Then you have these constellational models. They're all being refined, but they're refined to find the areas where they work. And Caleb ran this example this morning, and they sort of segment the jurisdiction like this automatically, where one model actually takes most of the area, but then 2 others are kind of modeling this other place. And that's by learning that lat long to model mapping function. And if you have that lat long to model mapping function, and then you use this distribution of models inside your prediction, then the whole thing is differentiable, so you can train both of these things, both the different models and predictions. Now, this spatial ensemble isn't something that you can now apply somewhere else. It's just a way for you to get as fast as you can to the labeling of that area. And this is what's different between this approach and sort of general machine teaching approach, because the goal isn't to create necessarily a best model that's going to work everywhere. Although if that happens, great. You can reuse some of these models in other places as starting points. But the goal is to get the labels. That's what people want. And the goal is to reduce the amount of labor that people do to get there. So it's more of a sort of a hybrid intelligence method than machine teaching method. Now, the collaborations that we have, we would like to do some longitudinal studies with Chesapeake and NOAA and ducks on wetlands mapping, and we have some ideas how to do it without labels, with just some loose guidance from NLCD, and also with that tool that I showed you. You can just as easily add a new label and start learning new things, and we've tested that a little bit with Chesapeake. Then we're working with World Bank and municipal governments in Myanmar and Vietnam on their resource mapping problem, because that's another example where you have a government doesn't have enough funds. Can you drop the costs of labor so much down that they can just do it using a tool like this? And then We actually have various internal products and CSS collaborations. I'm not even sure what is confidential, what's not, but there is interest in Microsoft in this business. Now, regarding the open problems, there's a lot of problems with this collaborative mapping and humans in the loop, and they're fascinating. If you're actually creating this system where humans are a node in your network, then they are, how do you analyze these things? How do you build the best ones? As Sid said, maybe the collaboration makes things worse. It's interesting too. And also, what is the human supposed to be doing in this? Are we supposed to tell people who to work with and what to work on? Or are they supposed to somehow self-select what works the best? And then in terms of machine learning, one big thing is unsupervised pre-training. The models that we pre-trained were pre-trained in Maryland on high-res labels and then use them everywhere else. Turns out you actually can kind of use them everywhere else. We went to Yangon, for example, and Sentinel imagery instead of NAPE imagery, which is 10-meter resolution, so totally wrong. And yet we were able to fine-tune that area relatively easily with the tool. But in general, you'll have a problem where the features that the model is extracting are really suited to the terrain where you train this and not to the new terrain. So instead, you could do unsupervised pre-training. And one of the things we were playing with is let's try to build an identity function using a neural network, which we know doesn't work. The neural networks can't learn identity function because they immediately get confused by correlations in the input data. So they start learning features that describe these correlations. But that's what we actually want in a new area. We want to learn what is how to basically learn sufficient statistics that explain the input and then map these sufficient statistics to the output. So Eli was playing with things like, given a patch, can you predict what the patch shifted by 15 meters looks like, or things like that. And so we can use these features then in the tool or for training with low-res labels. Then spatial ensembles, which I kind of described to a certain extent. Then the other thing is clustering models. The neural networks actually don't really cluster data. They threshold it, but they don't really compare input features. So we have developed this overlap clustering method, which is simply going over the image by moving a window and clustering everything inside the window and changing parameters of the clusters slowly. So that way you can get clustering of features or colors, and that can be better, especially in terms of getting these sharp features that GIS people like. UNets will actually create these blurry features in the end. And then there's a lot of these meta-learning approaches. So if we know that we're building these models so they can be overtrained later in the new area, should we just, how do we do it? Should we stop early in our learning, or should we actually learn it using a meta-learning approach so that we're learning the core method that's easily adaptable using the top two layers, and a variety of things like that. And it's been an hour, so I'm going to stop here. Any more questions?
Sorry for so many questions. I know you mentioned that human knowledge is being used in the form of labels, labels for pixels, right?
Yeah.
But I wonder if other sorts of human knowledge, such as, roads are often connected things,
Right.
can be useful as well to assist with the
Yeah, that would be
label.
nice. We have to change the interface. One of the problems we had is that we're not really user interface people. So we did the most simple thing that we can. And we're also thinking we can count things in terms of click, compare better. But obviously you can have better interfaces here where you can have bigger brushes, or you can make a stroke. So one of the things we were thinking about is if you allow people to do strokes or put pixels in the line, can the model also build the theory of mind of the human and say, well, let me see what that means. Let's try different things. Like, how far am I supposed to go from these pixels and believe that it's all the same label? Mm-hmm. So you can fine-tune those things as well. That would be very exciting, actually, if it worked, that you can kind of feel that the machine is learning from you, really.
Have you thought about using LiDAR data? So GIS has they're starting to have 1 meter resolution for 25% of US, and I think 5 meter for almost all of the US. And we know in the vision community that depth usually generalizes as well.
LiDAR would help a lot. We haven't done it yet. We keep talking about doing it, and we should. It will help a lot with buildings, for example. It can help with trees, can resolve the shadows on the roads, for example. Shadows on the roads are a big issue with these models. Yeah, extra data is always good.
What about synthetic aperture? Because I think the water especially really stands out with those.
Yeah, we will be getting some, this was NAPE imagery, but we will be getting some satellite data from Planet and from Airbus. Well, Airbus is drones, but we'll experiment with different things. But there's always an issue with the new terrain just looks different. It's just different water, different roads, different fields and so on. So I think it's quite possible that while that map of the United States at 4 classes that I showed you, somebody's going to make a much better next year, or will make not much better, and maybe that problem is going to be solved. There will always be open problems with new labels, new areas, new input imagery, and so on.
Do you have a sense of how much does the coarse label, how much values in the coarse label work against a fine label?
So we don't. It seemed that at one point it seemed like these fine labels, a few fine labels are enough. But then Kolya was playing with this, with wetlands in New Orleans or Louisiana using just a very simple heuristic how to use NLCD labels, and that helped quite a bit. And I'm guessing it really depends on the images.
Do you have a sense for how the people were choosing points to label?
Yeah, we started looking at that. And what we found was that those who retrained often were doing better in general because we allow people to test the model, but also to choose when to retrain. The whole thing was kind of organized with very low computational cost, just because that was the idea for our collaborators, that they wouldn't spend much money. And so they can't really see the effect immediately until they ask for it. So they have to retrain to see. And that helped. The other thing is that users typically didn't go for, try to balance the labels, have a little bit of each, and scattered across different areas. Going to when I do it, I go to the area that looks different from the area that I've just tested, and I come back later to check what happened. So those are the behaviors. And the other thing is that the best users actually do not correct mistakes only. Like they will actually click on a road, but then it will say, well, I'm sure you're going to now be confused. So they will also click on the water and say, this is water though. So those sort of things. And then we want to do some kind of an analysis, but we want more data too, to see whether we can maybe predict based on the pixel levels, what people are looking at. That image that I showed you of where people worked looks a lot like an attention map, like the visual attention map, like what the users are drawn to. And also we know that users are not optimizing for accuracy, overall accuracy, even though we told them that that's the goal. They want cities to look good, the roads to look good, the fine features to look good, and then they want the big features like the big field to be, most of the field is fine, but the boundary, who cares? So they have this sort of a distorted view of the whole thing. So the things that they care about is not quite the same as just mean accuracy.
One other question. What's the difference in performance between the best user and like the median user? Like, is there an opportunity for maybe teaching teachers to do a better job?
Yeah, that's what sort of Andy wants to run more experiments along those lines. The question is it just more time that people need? Is it that they didn't care? I mean, those things we have to work out. And then the other question is it that some people are very good at fine-tuning the model up to here, and then they stop? Blake, for example, spends too much time in one small area, right? He's just perfectionist there. And then there are people who are just all over the place. So this is fine with me. I don't care about these details. So then maybe Blake and that person should work together. So those are the sort of things we want to explore as well.
So did you look at, so after they fine-tune a model on one tile, presumably have you looked at applying it to another tile, and does that do better than the pre-trained model, or is it useless?
Actually, Caleb, you did that, right?
Yeah, It's not as good, but it's still better than the baseline.
It's better than baseline, but kind of drops off after a while.
I think it'd be kind of interesting to what tiles should you have the people work on for one, but then can you learn what adaptation is happening? I don't know if that's a learnable, it's like a meta learning thing, learn how to adapt for a new tile, given a bunch of examples of adaptations for other tiles.
Yeah, we have to look at that. Can we predict just by appearance of the tile what we should do, how we should start, even which base model to start with? Copy another model, and the other approaches are if a lot of work has already been done, the user can come to a tile and just flip through a few different models and say, I'm going to start with this one. All of these things we have to try. One thing, I didn't show you the tool, but when you see the tool, then you sort of get the sense of the scale of the problem, that all of these things are not like running one more experiment over the weekend. So this is the tool that we have. And so this is the United States, and this is where we trained. So you can click and get a prediction. If the server is up,
really
so here it goes. And it works well in Chesapeake. And then if you zoom out, you see how tiny that place where it works is. And then you go to Florida. And then you can see this is totally different. I mean, you have to spend some time thinking about what this is. I guess the best would be to call this wetlands, I guess. And so here you're going to get a few predictions and see, it thinks it's a forest. It's at best low vegetation, it's probably wetlands. And then if you go to Arizona or Texas, totally different terrain, different images. So, so what I'm saying is that task is large. So all of these ideas are great, and we'll have to prioritize somehow, unless somebody also wants to help out, which will be great. But these experiments are going to take time.
Why does the cursor not change the scale as well? Because if that is allowed, then you can also get coarse to fine segmentation as a human would do it.
Oh yeah, sure. We could actually train. That's the other thing we were talking about. Never did fully, although one person experimented with it a couple of years ago, the multi-resolution approach. And actually, Caleb wanted to try one using the quad tree representation of the images. And that might help with roads, for example. Roads are very long, so from up here you can detect the road more easily than when you zoom in all the way. So it can be a guidance. Yeah.
All right, let's thank the speaker again.